You are listening to Accent, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. My name is Katerina. I'm the host, and my guest today is Erik Reese. Erik Reese is a teacher and a writer, and we have the pleasure of talking to him again. Hi. Hi, Erik.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing great. Very happy to talk to you.
Good to talk to you as well. Good to talk to anybody.
And it's been a while. I mean, you have been on Accents in the past, and then at the time, we were talking about the book that was about to come out, or you were about to finish, and that was Utopia Drive, a road trip through America's most radical idea. And the book has been out for a few years now, and I thought that we can go back to this moment in time, and you can introduce the book to our listeners again.
Sure. So this was a book that I had this. A lot of times I think about books and I think about wrapping them around road trips. I just really like road trips. And so I got the idea for this is that I would just drive to 8 different utopian communities, some that are no longer in existence and some that are in existence, and just sort of see, what they had in common, what was driving them. In the 19th century, this idea of, starting utopian communities was really in the air. And there was, the country then was still a very young country. And there was, this idea that after the stock market crash of 1838, that, people could just start reinventing societies and, on a smaller scale. And they did. So the Shakers did it. A lot of socialist, anarchist communities did it. And a lot of what, people always say, people use utopian as almost a dismissive term, like it's something so unrealistic, we don't even need to talk about it. And so what I'm kind of arguing in this book is that actually these communities survived for a very, very long time in some cases. Some are still going today. And that kind of idealism that they embodied, it never really disappeared under the crunch of the capitalist machine. And so I was trying to kind of revive that secret history, if you will.
So you did take 8 road trips to 8 different utopian communities?
Well, I actually made it one road trip, okay. And I just drove all around the country east of the Mississippi River.
Well, can you tell us which were the 8 communities that you visited?
Sure. Well, I started right down the street from me with Shakertown,
right.
That's 15 miles away from my house. That's the Shaker community of Pleasant Hill. And that was an amazing community, built around the teachings of a woman named Mother Ann Lee, who kind of imagined herself as the bride of Jesus. And so that was a fascinating place. I went to the first socialist community in America in New Harmony, Indiana. I went to a place that still exists in Virginia called Twin Oaks. They've been around since 1967, which is the year I was born. And I went to Walden Pond, try to think about a kind of utopia as a solitary endeavor that Thoreau was practicing there beside Walden Pond. And so, yeah, I just kind of I went west, then I went north, then I came back east, and finally made it back home.
How long did it take you to take this journey?
It took I broke it up into 2 chunks just so I could get home and mow the grass. But overall, it took about a month.
Did you take, well, I guess what I want to ask is, did you take the journey on your own, and then were you changed by that trip yourself?
Yeah, I did take it on my own. I just wanted to be sort of unencumbered to do all the research I needed to do. And, when I went to the community called Twin Oaks in Virginia, they allowed me to stay there for free room and board if I did some work on their farm, which I was glad to do. I ended up writing about it. And so, I was just kind of doing things like that, meeting people and, just kind of getting a sense of what a culture that doesn't have banks, doesn't have lawyers, doesn't have prisons, doesn't have a hierarchy, in some cases doesn't have money, what that looks like. And the subtitle for the book is A Road Trip Through America's Most Radical Idea, because obviously that is a very radical idea. It's very foreign to Americans to think that way. And so I mean, one thing I learned is that it's really hard to live that way. It's really hard to live your values. I don't do it. I buy clothes that are made in Bangladesh. I mean, there's a trail of blood that leads to my door. I mean, I try, but I don't do a good enough job. But these are, I met people who really, really, really were trying to live their values, on just a real profound level.
That was going to be my next question. Did you meet any interesting people on that journey? Any people who you're still in touch with, or anybody who influenced you in some significant way?
Yeah, the thing about the communities that no longer exist is they were all started by really sort of charismatic, flamboyant people, whether it was Mother Ann Lee with the Shakers or John Noyes, who started a kind of free love society up in Oneida, New York. They were just these really powerful presences that people gravitated towards. And I found like, in some ways you would think, well, the Shakers in a free love community, are the complete opposite, but in a way they weren't. They shared things in common. They were completely non-hierarchical. Women had as much say in the community as men, and one was secular, one was religious. But what I found was there was just a lot of commonality. If you read the book of Acts in the New Testament, it says that the earliest Christians community, the line is that they held all property in common. That's a line from the book of Acts. I have never, ever heard a preacher quote that in my long experience going to church. That's something that American mainstream Christianity is very uncomfortable with, but it's there. That idea of a radical communitarianism, I mean, it's right there. So it makes sense that some of these communities were religious, and it makes sense that some of them, found religion to be an impediment that they had to, put aside.
So do you think that these communities are or would have been better prepared for a pandemic such as the one we're experiencing now?
It's a good question. I wrote all this before the pandemic, so I haven't really given it much thought. But I think they would be. For one thing, they're very isolated, and so there's that element of it. Even both the secular and the religious communities, there was this withdrawal from the world. To be completely self-reliant, completely self-sufficient. So, the pressures that created the pandemic, all of these urban pressures that created the pandemic, that they don't exist for these communities. And I mean, like the Amish, I would think they have a lot better immune systems, just based on their diet and the fact that they work with livestock and that sort of thing.
So having written this book, do you have more hope or less hope for the future?
I don't use the word hope anymore.
Okay.
I don't like it. I don't like it as a word. I don't like it as an idea. I I think hope sounds to me like false hope. Hope sounds like something that you just have it, but you don't do anything to bring about any kind of change. So I'm much more interested in action than I am in hope. Uh, I frankly don't have a lot of hope right now. Um, I just wrote an article for Harper's about the deeply pessimistic poet, American poet Robinson Jeffers, who, basically said it's time to give the world back over to the other animals who can run it better than we do. And I'm deeply sympathetic to that point of view. There's been these conversations in the last couple of years, should the human race go extinct? You know, Frankly, I think it would be better for the planet if the human race went extinct, and that would not bother me at all. Having said that, I would grieve the suffering that went with that. And so the place I kind of am right now is with James Baldwin, which is that life is inherently tragic, but it also can be a life of dignity. We can face the tragedy of the future, climate change, pandemics, everything that's coming. We might not beat it, but we can face it with dignity, and we can face it by caring for each other and doing the best we can to weather those storms. So no, I'm not hopeful, but I also don't believe that I should sit here and do nothing. I started an organization a few years back. It was actually when Trump got elected, because I just felt like I needed to do something. I started an organization called Kentucky Writers and Artists for Reforestation, which I would love for you to join and be part of. But we plant trees on strip mines every
I'll
year
be
in the
there.
spring. And so, that's something I can do. I can go on a strip mine and I can get a bunch of friends that I know, like you, and we can plant, 8,000 saplings in a day. And each one of those trees, if it lives, will sequester 22 tons of carbon over its life. So that's what I mean. It's not that we need to sit back and do nothing. And just let the chips fall. I think there's a lot for us to do, but I also feel like the challenges are incredibly serious. And so I just don't use the word hope anymore. That's a long answer to your question.
Well, that took the conversation a different direction. I'll share with you a conversation that I had, or I didn't have, with a very interesting older gentleman about 10 years ago. And he basically said something like, yeah, things are not going well. We are getting off the earth at the right time. That's what he said. And and I guess I reacted sharply and I said something like, well, I don't believe that. And probably what I meant was, well, I'm afraid of what you just said, and I didn't want to hear it. Now, from like 13 years later, I'm able to judge my own reaction a little better. But I never forgot that little snippet of conversation. And I have avoided this gentleman for the rest of the evening because I didn't want to hear what he had to say. And you say that, you yourself said there is a trail of blood to my door. There is, sand where I live, and I have put my head in it because what's outside is just too frightening and too big for me to do anything. And you say, I can do something, which I admire greatly.
There's a really good article. It was a piece published by Derek Jensen a few years ago about this idea of hope, and he was kind of saying what I'm saying. And he said that people say to him, well, if you feel that way, why don't you just kill yourself? And his response to that is, I really like my life. I don't want to kill myself. I like my life. I love my life. I just know that I'm living a life with these larger forces that I can only do so much about. So, I think you can keep those two ideas in your head at once. I think you were avoiding that guy because, you just didn't want to get brought down by his pessimism.
Right.
And I guess what I would say there is, I don't think, having this kind of, just what I think of as a realistic view of the future, that doesn't stop us from, just loving the fact that the wildflowers are blooming in my woods right now. I'm going fly fishing in Montana this summer. These things that I love to do.
So back to the book, and if you at this point would create a utopian society, having learned so much about them, would you? First of all, would you? And then if you would, where would you start? What would you do?
Well, I would start at Shakertown.
Okay.
I would, I mean, all of that, all the infrastructure is still there. Um, uh, when my wife and I went there right before I started writing the book, she said to me, she swears she didn't say this, but she did say it, and I put it in the book. She said, this is such a great place. Why would anybody come here and refuse to have sex with one another? And her idea, I think, was that, if you got beyond the idea that the Shakers were abstinent, and you could rebuild a utopian community there, and you wouldn't have those, that kind of religious, kind of chastity stricture on it. But if you took that away, you could get 100 people together, and you could have a pretty damn good time at being self-sufficient, farming, on that land. Of course, it's you couldn't do that because it's it's a historic monument now. But I just look at Shakertown, and I look at the way it's laid out. You can get to everything in 15 minutes by walking. The Shakers would, they'd do 2 hours of work here and then go do 2 hours of work here and 2 hours of work there. They were generalists, so they never got bogged down in their work. They never got bored with their work. So I think on some level, that's very appealing to me. On another level, I'm kind of a solitary figure. And I think living, uh, cheek to jowl with 100 other people would probably really start to bother me. When I went to Twin Oaks in Virginia, and I met those 100 people who were doing it, they were doing a great job of it. I mean, they obviously had problems, but as much as I admired their community, I don't think I could live there because I just need a lot of time to myself. And that's why I kind of went to Walden and thought about this idea of a utopia of one person,
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, from as someone who grew up in a socialistic country on its, quoting, on its way to a communist society, which is by its nature and definition of utopian society. And I know how that thing, I guess, failed.
Yeah.
And why that failed. And I know how good it sounds, by description and as an ideal to strive.
Well, the great mistake that Eastern Europe made, and that all the communist cultures made, was they tried to impose it top down. They tried to impose communism on people rather than letting the socialism grow organically.
Right.
I mean, you can't have capitalism on the scale that we have it in this country without immense cruelty, the kind of cruelty that we have in this country. And you can't have communism on that kind of scale without immense cruelty. So I don't think it really matters the political system. I think when you scale up to the size of the Soviet Union or the United States, I mean, it doesn't work. But I think if you had capitalism on a very, very local level, and you had socialism on a very local level, where you didn't have venture capitalists and predatory lenders and coal operators taking advantage of people and polluting their air and water, then I think either system could work. But again, it had Wendell Berry's been talking about this for 60 years, but it has to happen on a small scale.
Well, also, the other word that you said to me is a keyword. That's the word cruelty. You cannot, nothing that it has cruelty as fundamental value. It can turn out in a beautiful way.
And I think that's the thing that really appealed to me about these places. And again, the one I visited that's still operational in Virginia. There's no sexual abuse there. There's no violence. There's no physical abuse. There's no hierarchies. There just isn't, because they're small, and there's not a power structure. And if there were people who were abusive, then they would quickly be dealt with by the community, and they would be shamed, and they would either change their ways or be driven out. So it's what you're really thinking about here is a radical decentralization of of communities. I mean, my own utopia view is that you would take the 480 watersheds in the United States, and you would make every watershed its own state, if you will, because a watershed is geographically self-sufficient. The water comes into the watershed, no waste goes out of the watershed. I mean, it's a literal defining of boundaries, boundaries created by the geography, the geology, but it's also a great metaphor for really small decentralized societies that are self-reliant, and that don't have a lot of the problems that we have when we just scale up to the size that we are now.
Right. And water is life. So that's important too.
What's that?
Water is life.
Yeah.
And that is, I guess, the genesis. That could be the genesis as for creation of, did you say 490 watersheds?
Something like that. Yeah. We have, I think we have eight different watersheds in Kentucky. So, even if Kentucky was divided out into those different watersheds, what seems to me is like all of these people, all of these angry white men who keep, complaining that it's somebody else's fault, they wouldn't get to anymore, because it's their watershed. They're going to have to take care of it, and they're going to have to step up and practice, real citizenship, real responsibility. I compare it to like a strip mine, because a strip mine is the opposite of a watershed. A strip mine pollutes water, it causes erosion, it doesn't hold soil in place, it creates flooding, it drives wildlife away, drives human life away, and a watershed does completely the opposite. And so you can look at an industrial culture, based on the strip mine, or you can look at an ecological culture based on a watershed.
Would you kindly read us from this book?
Okay. I'll just read the beginning. The corner of 5th and Elm Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, has held a certain significance for me since the day I stood there with my parents as an 8-year-old in 1976 and watched the Cincinnati Reds return to the city after their 7-game victory over the Boston Red Sox in what was, as my father told me then, and as I still believe, the greatest World Series ever. I made note of the cross streets where we stood because I felt sure that catching a glimpse of Pete Rose, Joe Morgan, and Johnny Bench would be the most important thing that had happened up to that point in my life, and might well be for some time to come. 10 years later, I was scanning the radical thought section of a used bookstore in the town where I had just arrived for college. My eyes fixed on the faded purple spine of a book by George Lockwood called The New Harmony Movement. It is a history of this country's first secular utopian experiment undertaken in 1825 by the Scottish industrialist Robert Owen in a small Indiana town called New Harmony. The copy I pulled from the shelf was a first edition published in 1905. Its cloth cover had been worn smooth, and the gilt lettering on the spine had almost disappeared. Still, there seemed to me something talismanic about the book. It held, after all, a secret, the secret of society. I slowly flipped through its pages until I hit upon this passage. On the 18th of May, 1827, there was unpretentiously opened at the corner of 5th and Elm Streets in Cincinnati a small country store conducted on a plan new to commerce. It was the first equity store designed to illustrate and enact the cost principle, the germ of the cooperative movement in the future, unquote. And 149 years later, I stood at that same corner, the crossroads of Utopia, as it turned out, to watch a ticker tape parade for the world champion Reds. So anyway, what struck me about that is that the corner of 5th and Elm Street is where the very first co-op in this country was started by a guy named Joshua Warren. And the fact that I had stood there, you know, as a little kid watching the Reds come home, I just thought was funny. So the journey, my journey starts from there.
Well, thank you very much for reading. How was the book received? Have you had any feedback from readers?
Yeah, it's funny. It came out for some reason in 2017. 5 different books about utopian communities came out.
Wow.
Almost at the same time. And so it was kind of strange because I was kind of jockeying with these other books, for attention. And the New Yorker wrote a review of several of the books together, and they included my book in it. So, that was kind of odd. If it had been the only book about utopia communities, it might have done a little better, but it did fine. And it was interesting to see that during that year, it's always strange. Sometimes like things in publishing just happen that way, where suddenly there's a couple of books and there's this zeitgeist, like, why now? But, anyway.
Thank you. And the other book that I would like us to speak about is your latest. And your latest book is a book of essays, Practice, Resurrection, and Other Essays, out in 2017 from Counterpoint Press. Please tell us about it.
That's a collection of essays I've been working on really over the past 15 years or past 20 years. Just pieces. I find that the things I really seem to obsess about as a writer over and over and again, I just obsess about 3 topics, which is family, religion, and the natural world. and I just keep coming back to those things over and over. And so if you read this collection of essays, you'll see that some of it's autobiographical about my religious upbringing. A lot of it's about the natural world and environmental concerns, and some of them are about the weaving together of family and religion.
Can we hear an excerpt, please?
Sure. This is a book. This is an essay I wrote about my mentor, Guy Davenport. He died in 2005, and I met him at UK. I went to the University of Kentucky in the 80s because nobody else would take me. I couldn't get in any other college, any other university.
I find that hard to believe, but okay.
I just had terrible high school grades. I'm not a good test taker, so my SAT and ACT scores were terrible. And so, I just went to the state school. Back then, you could get into UK. It's hard to believe right now, but you filled out a postcard and you mailed in a postcard. And if you were an in-state student, they pretty much had to take you. So that's how I ended up at UK. What I didn't anticipate was that there was a writer teaching at the University of Kentucky against all odds named Guy Davenport, who would later win a MacArthur Genius Award. And he was a genius who he liked living in Kentucky because everybody left him alone. He didn't want to teach at Harvard where he had gone. And so, he liked Kentucky for that reason. And so he and I, I was his student, and we later became friends. And I was with him in the last days of his life. So I wrote this remembrance of him. It's called Stylist Needed, Remembering Guy Davenport. And the title comes from, there's a little hair salon right around the corner from where he used to live. And there was a sign out in front of the hair salon that said Stylist Needed. And I just thought that was great that it was like right around the corner from him, because I thought Guy was like, the greatest prose stylist of his generation. So I took him down there one day and we took a picture of him sitting next to the sign. But anyway, here's the beginning of that essay. Guy Davenport died on a gray winter morning in January 2005. As if on cue, my watch stopped working that day, which made me think of W.H. Auden's elegy for William Butler Yeats, who also, as it turned out, died in January. But Auden doesn't say that the clock stopped, as I wrongly remembered, but rather, and I'm quoting, the mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Oh, all the instruments agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. On that dark, cold day more than 10 years ago, I stood on my front porch with Guy's companion of 30 years, Bonnie Jean Cox. We exchanged the usual and inadequate words that follow death. Then Bonnie turned to me and said, I think only a few of us truly understood the innocence of Guy's mind. The earth did not, as Auden said of Yeats, receive an honored guest. Guy's corpse, ravaged by a lifetime of chronic smoking, was left to the University of Kentucky's Markey Cancer Center for research. On an early spring day later that year, about 50 of us, his family members, former students, friends, and colleagues, gathered at the UK Arboretum and memorialized Guy with a simple plaque set beneath a handsome sweet gum tree. The plaque read, "Every force evolves a form." Bonnie Jean chose that inscription from one of Guy's titles, itself a statement by Shaker founder Mother Ann Lee. Guy, it could be said, admired equally the modernist architecture of Le Corbusier and the Shaker broom. A coherent culture, like the 19th century Shaker village not far from where Guy lived in Lexington, is full of forces that make themselves intelligent through art, architecture, and citizenship. The force that was Guy Davenport evolved and evoked a protean arsenal of forms. Poems, stories, essays, novels, translations, paintings, wooden tables, even a fried bologna sandwich that he would serve up for dinner, assuming you would eat it. I ate many of them. Sometimes we would stand in the old-fashioned kitchen of his house at 621 Sayre Avenue and eat the sandwiches right over the frying pan. A large poster of the moon hung on the opposite wall. It was a satellite that fascinated Guy, the lonely, distant moon. We might gaze at it for a moment, and then Guy would turn and say, "Want a Snickers?" So there you go.
Thank you. You've been writing poems, and you're also an author of a poetry book, but I know you've been writing a few more. Tell us about what topics. Is it still family, religion, and natural world, or are there any other themes that have snuck in?
Yeah, it's not so much family anymore, though I think religion, it's very much the natural world. I live in Woodford County. I'm lucky enough to live on a beautiful creek called Clear Creek. And so a lot of the poems that I've been writing have been grounded in the local ecosystem around here, the geography, the plants, the animals. But what I was trying to do, these are 10-line poems. Each poem is broken up into 2 quatrains, and it's a form called the decathic. I have since learned the 10-line poem, and they the first quatrain starts at the top left of the page, and the second quatrain's at the bottom right of the page, and there's a lot of white space in the middle, which I really like the look of on the page. I've always liked poems like Charles Simic and a lot of modernist poets who leave a lot of white space around as a kind of weather for the words. It's almost an admission in my reading of the fact that words aren't adequate to what the poet wants to say, and the white space is there to acknowledge that. Anyway, here's one. This is the first one in the collection. Flying squirrels careen through dreams, and we awaken the woods with our heads on a mound of feathers. Hickory leaves start to fall like crumpled masks the wind used to wear. Desire is the syntax of design. The sin of orchids teasing hawk moths is the language to which we all aspire, the music we have never heard. So they're kind of like that, just real short, kind of dense poems. Let's see if I can find one more to read. Here's one. A monkey hides inside the letter Q, or so the linguists say. Its tail dangles over the pale blue line in a child's composition book. The child still sees the monkey. They each imagine the other beyond a row of black bars, beyond the othering of each. There they will swing through the trees like twirling chromosomes. So just kind of, they're kind of whimsical little things. But I decided, just as a pandemic exercise, I would just kind of work on these for maybe an hour each morning until I had 50. I thought that'd be a good stopping point.
And what other things are you writing, and you have been writing since 2017?
The main thing I'm working on right now is a book about, well, the genesis of the book is the fact that we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial, which is the famous trial in Dayton, Tennessee, about the teaching, where they tried to outlaw the teaching of evolution in public schools. And it's one of the most famous trials in American history. People just call it the Scopes monkey trial because it was about evolution. But one of the things that's fascinating is that a lot of that whole story has real Kentucky roots. John Scopes, who was the teacher who was on trial, went to the University of Kentucky. He was a student at UK. His teacher was a guy that his students called Monkey Miller because he taught evolution. And there's, if you know this, Katerina, there's a Miller Hall on campus, which is named after Monkey Miller. And if you can believe this, he was a biology teacher and the first football coach at UK. So
the first what coach? The first football coach?
The football coach, yeah. I mean, you can't imagine that happening today, obviously, but yeah, it was like, it was different times. And so he was one of Scopes's teachers, and another one of his teachers was Dr. Funkhauser, a zoologist who also has a building named after him. And Funkhauser was one of the people who ended up doing the categorizing and the taxonomy for some of the species that Darwin brought back from the voyage of the beagle. I'm sorry. So he was a famous zoologist. So by the time John Scopes got down to Dayton, Tennessee as a teacher, he was also a football coach. What happened was some town leaders read in the Chattanooga paper that the ACLU would support any teacher who would teach, who would willingly violate the law in Tennessee and teach evolution in the schools. And so the town leaders in Dayton thought, well, this will be great for the town if we could like kind of, get some publicity out of this if we could find a teacher to do it. So they called John Scopes into the drugstore and said, would you, have you taught evolution in your science classes? And he said he had. He said he had good evolution teachers at UK, and they said, would you stand trial? And he was a bachelor, he was young, he didn't have anything to lose. So he said, yeah, I will. And of course, he became the most notorious high school teacher in America, being the man who was put on trial for teaching evolution in schools. So anyway, my the book is
so let me ask you this, because I do not know. That's the first time I hear about it. Maybe because I grew up somewhere else. So what was the outcome of the trial?
So the outcome of the trial was that Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution. And
guilty of what? Of blasphemy or what?
No, so the Tennessee legislature had passed the law in 1923 banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. They tried to do it here in Kentucky, and the president of UK, Dr. McVeigh, went before the Kentucky state legislature and said, this is a terrible idea. Don't let this happen in Kentucky. And the Kentucky legislature, by one vote, overruled the law against teaching evolution. So everybody, all of these religious, zealots, they went down to Tennessee, and in Tennessee, they got the law passed. And so, So that's where the huge fight, that's where the fight started. And of course, it's gone up to the present day. We still, in cases in states like Kansas, there's still fights over teaching evolution in schools, whether or not, this idea of intelligent design should be given equal time in science classes. So this is an issue that's just, it's plagued America for just a very long time. This struggle between religion and science. And we really see it now with just the anti-science, rhetoric that began with the Trump administration and continues with these anti-masker Republicans. And so I think this book is really relevant right now because we're really, facing all these anti-science forces. So anyway, the subtitle of the book is Evolution, Education, and Democracy. And I'm just beginning, I'm trying to tell the story of the Scopes monkey trial because it's just the most amazing story in the world. And then I'm also trying to, along the way, tell the story of the theory of evolution and what it means and why it's important and why it's something that needs to be taken seriously by Americans who are worried about pandemics.
So are you almost ready with this manuscript?
I'm about halfway through it. The New York publishing industry just kind of shut down during the pandemic, so everything's going pretty slow. But I've been working with my editor lately, and we're moving forward with it. So the actual anniversary is 2025, which is still a ways off. But the book may come out before then.
Well, I have one more question, and this is a question that I ask all my guests who teach creative writing. And that is, what is the most important thing you teach your students? Well, okay, I'm going to ask this question for you in two parts. One is, because you have had a famous teacher, what is the most important thing you learned from Guy Davenport? And then, what is the most important thing you teach your students? If there is one thing you want them to remember from you, what is it?
I think the most important thing I learned from Guy was just an insatiable curiosity about the world, which led him to, go track down writers like Samuel Beckett and James Joyce and Ezra Pound and meet them and talk to them and try to figure out, what the hell is going on in their work.
Yeah.
Literature wasn't something he taught, it was something he breathed. And that really had an impact on me. Just that it was just it just enriched his life so much to be surrounded by those works of literature and those works of art and those works of music. And I looked at Guy and I just saw somebody who seemed to me just completely alive. He wasn't sleepwalking through his life. He was enjoying every minute of his life. And that had a profound impact on me. What I hope I can communicate to my students, and I think this is, one of the most important things that a teacher can communicate is just, the passion you have for the subject matter. Whether it's teaching literature or whether it's teaching creative writing, just I want to communicate to my students that, this is something that, I couldn't live without this. This is just something that's profoundly important to me. And, I want them to sense that. And I want, these students, they're pretty hard to impress. They've got information coming at them all the time. And so, in my class, I just try to slow all that down and say, when you're working on the sentence level in an essay, you're trying to cultivate a sense of voice. It is nobody else's voice but your own. And that's very hard to do when you just have this homogenous churn of voices in your ear all the time. And you just have all these other voices telling you what you should think and not letting you think for yourself. So I really try to work on that with my students. But if you're asking the question on a technical level, I think one of the most important things I try to teach students is the power of the image. There's such psychological power that an image conveys. And, I think about, the poets I love the most, like somebody like Charles Simic, or Mary Oliver, who they just, they're not confessing anything. They're just putting strange images together in conjunction, and they're letting the imagery do all of this really weird psychological work that an image can do. And I really try to communicate that to my students, that, just a really well-placed image in a text can, be devastating. So yeah.
I like the word devastating, and especially I like it's following curiosity, passion. Thank you, Erik, for coming on Accents and giving so much of yourself and reading us from your book, your poems, telling us about your future plans. And I say things to the virtual mic and the abundant universe listen. So I'm going to wish for us in not too distant future to be again together on Accents and talk about that new book that has just come out before 2025, right? And we talk about the monkey trials, evolution, its significance, and Kentucky, and again about your future plans. because there are lots of books that are in use still.
That'd be great. I always love talking to you, Katerina.
Thank you, Erik.
All right. Bye-bye.